The summer of 1878 came to Texas like a fever-hot, relentless, unforgiving. The
We
kind of
ride
heat
now.
that made
No
men
turning
mean
back.
and desperate
I'm with you. Let's
things
end this.
seem
Stay
reasonable.
sharp. They're close.
It was the sort of season
Stay
when a
close to
woman
me.
might sell
I
her
will.
soul for shade,
Let's go.
when a debt of $500 could buy a life or end one, when the line between salvation and damnation blurred like the horizon in the midday shimmer. Evangeline Ashford learned this truth on a Wednesday afternoon in June, standing in the dust of a cattle ranch 15 miles from anywhere that mattered, with her 5-year-old son's hand gripping her skirt, and the last of her money, exactly $4.30, sewn into the hem of her traveling dress. She had come west on the promise of distance, on the desperate mathematics of running. Boston to Philadelphia. Philadelphia to St. Louis. St. Louis to this God-forsaken corner of Texas, where the Red River carved its way through land so flat a man could see tomorrow coming. Each city had bought her a week, maybe two, before Chase Whitmore's men found her trail again. Each time she'd gathered Silas in the night and moved like smoke, leaving behind whatever couldn't be carried in one carpetbag and a mother's trembling arms. But running required money, and money was something Evangeline Ashford no longer possessed. The ranch spread before her like a promise she couldn't read. Wooden buildings, weathered silver by the sun, corrals holding horses that looked half wild cattle in the distance like dark punctuation marks on an endless page of grass. A windmill turned lazy circles against the sky, creaking a rhythm that sounded like resignation. Everything here spoke of permanence, of men who stayed, of roots driven deep into unforgiving soil. Everything she was not. "Mama, I'm thirsty." Silas's voice carried the thin edge of a complaint he'd been swallowing for hours. His face, smudged with travel dust, had gone pale beneath the grime. They'd walked the last 3 miles from where the mail coach had left them, and the boy's legs were short. "Soon, sweet one." Evangeline smoothed his hair blonde like his father's, though she tried not to think of William anymore, tried not to remember that love had worn his face before it had worn bruises. "We're here now, here." The Bar B Ranch, according to the sun-faded sign they'd passed a quarter-mile back. The advertisement she'd seen posted in Red River had been brief, almost curt housekeeper needed. Room and board, $15 monthly. Inquire Brennan Ranch, Red River Road. $15 was not enough to outrun a $500 debt, but it was enough to eat. Enough to give Silas a bed that didn't change every week. Enough to stop just for a moment and breathe, if they'd have her. The main house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the oppressive warmth carrying the smell of cooking meat. And something else, something that made her stomach clench with hunger, she'd been ignoring since yesterday's breakfast. A woman appeared in the doorway as they approached, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, her black hair streaked with silver and bound in a thick braid that fell past her waist. She wore a simple dress the color of dried clay and an expression that suggested she'd seen stranger things than a dusty woman and child appearing out of the afternoon glare. "You lost." The woman's voice carried the musical accent of Mexico, warm and rounded at the edges. "I'm looking for work." Evangeline lifted her chin, held her spine straight, despite the exhaustion that wanted to fold her in half. Dignity, she'd learned, was sometimes the only thing poverty couldn't take. The posting in town said a housekeeper was needed. The woman studied her with eyes that missed nothing. The quality of Evangeline's dress beneath the dust. The good leather of her shoes now splitting at the seams, the way Silas pressed close to his mother's side like a creature seeking shelter. A working woman's eyes reading the story of another woman's fall. "That posting's been up for 2 months. Nobody comes out this far for $15. A pause. "Nobody who don't have to." "I have to." Something shifted in the woman's face, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that passed between women who understood what necessity looked like. "I'm Paloma Reyes. I cook and keep the house, but my hands ain't what they used to be. and there's 12 men need feeding every day." She wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron. "The boy yours—" "Yes, Silas, he's 5. He's quiet, he won't be trouble." "Didn't ask if he was trouble, asked if he was yours." Paloma's expression softened slightly. "Kids ain't trouble out here. It's the lack of them that hurts." Before Evangeline could parse that statement, Paloma stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside. Get the boy water. Mr. Brennan's due back before supper. He'll want to see you himself." The interior of the house was cooler dim after the brutal sunlight. Evangeline's eyes adjusted slowly to reveal a large room that served as kitchen and living space both. A massive iron stove dominated one wall, already radiating warmth despite the weather. A wooden table, scarred from years of use, stood in the center with chairs enough for a dozen men. The floor was wood swept clean, and the walls held the kind of careful order that spoke of someone who valued function over decoration. But it was the rifle above the mantel that caught her eye, a Winchester oiled and obviously maintained, positioned where a man could reach it in seconds. Next to it hung a faded photograph in a simple frame, a man, a woman, and a child who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. All three were dressed in Sunday clothes, stiff and formal for the camera, but the woman's hand rested on the man's shoulder with an intimacy that made the posed photograph feel somehow alive. "That was Mrs. Brennan," Paloma said quietly, following Evangeline's gaze. "Miriam and their daughter Abigail, both dead these 8 years. Fever took them same week." "I'm sorry. Sorry don't change nothing." Paloma ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup, handed it to Silas, who drank like a creature dying of thirst. "But Mr. Brennan, he ain't been the same since. This house used to be full of light. Now it's just a place he sleeps between, working himself near to death." Evangeline wanted to ask more, but bootsteps on the porch stopped her tongue. Heavy, measured the walk of a man who didn't hurry for anything. The door opened, and Tobias Brennan stepped into his own house like a man entering foreign territory. He was taller than Evangeline expected, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled the doorframe. 46 years old, she'd later learn, though he carried those years in the silver threading through his dark hair, in the lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. He'd removed his hat on the porch, revealing a face that was all hard planes and sharp angles, weathered by sun and circumstance, into something that might have been handsome once before grief had hollowed it out. His eyes were the color of a storm, coming gray-blue and sharp as broken glass. They settled on Evangeline with the kind of focus that made her feel simultaneously seen and assessed. Paloma. He didn't look at the older woman, didn't shift his attention from Evangeline's face. "We expecting company. She's here about the housekeeper position." Paloma refilled the water cup for Silas, who'd already drained it. "Been on the road a while, looks like." "That's so." Tobias Brennan set his hat on a peg by the door with the careful precision of a man who did everything deliberately. His shirt was stained with sweat and dust, his pants worn at the knees. He smelled of horses and leather and the particular musk of hard physical labor. "What's your name?" "Evangeline Ashford. This is my son Silas." "Where's Mr. Ashford?" The question was blunt, not unkind, but it hit like a fist anyway. "Dead, 6 months now." Tobias absorbed this information with a slight nod, then pulled out a chair from the table and sat gesturing for her to do the same. It wasn't a request. Evangeline sat keeping her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Silas pressed against her side, small and warm and unnaturally quiet. "You know anything about running a house this size?" Tobias leaned back in the chair, those sharp eyes never leaving her face. "I can cook, clean, mend. I kept a house in Boston before—" She stopped herself. Before was a country she couldn't afford to visit. "I'm a quick learner for whatever I don't know." "Boston." He said it like he was tasting the word, finding it foreign. "Long way from there to here." "Yes. Woman don't travel that far without a reason." It wasn't a question, but the statement hung in the air like a challenge. Evangeline felt her throat tighten. This was the moment of truth, the place where every other door had closed. Lie, and he'd find out eventually. Tell the truth, and he'd send her back into the heat and the endless running. She chose truth. I'm in debt, $500. My husband gambled, borrowed from the wrong people. When he died, the debt became mine. The man who holds it, Chase Whitmore, he's not a patient creditor. Her voice remained steady, though her hands had begun to shake in her lap. I came west to find work to pay it back slowly. But he's been following, and I'm running out of places to run. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Silas had gone still, understanding in the way children do that something important was happening, something that would determine where they slept tonight. Tobias studied her with those pale eyes, and she couldn't read what he saw, couldn't tell if he was calculating her worth or her damage. Finally, he spoke. $500 is a lot of money. Yes. Man willing to chase a woman across half the country for that kind of debt ain't the type to give up easy. No. Her voice cracked slightly. He's not. What happens when he finds you here, I don't know. The truth of it made her feel hollow. I don't know anymore. Tobias pushed back from the table and stood moving to the window that looked out over his land. For a long moment he was silent, a dark shape against the bright square of glass. When he turned back, his expression had shifted into something harder, more decided. I'll make you an offer, Mrs. Ashford. You hear me out before you answer. Evangeline nodded, not trusting her voice. This ranch is 500 acres. I run about 200 head of cattle with the help of 8 men year-round, more during drives. I built it from nothing after the war, and I intend to leave it to my children when I die. He paused, something painful crossing his face. Problem is, I got no children, not anymore. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Brennan, but I don't see. I need an heir. He cut across her words like an axe through kindling. I'm 46 years old. I buried my wife and daughter 8 years ago, and I swore I'd never love again, never put my heart in a place where God could reach it and tear it out. I meant that oath, still mean it. Evangeline felt something cold settling in her stomach, understanding dawning before he spoke the words. But I need sons. Sons to work this land when my back gives out, to inherit what I've built, to make sure everything I've bled for don't just disappear when I'm gone. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was discussing the price of feed. So here's what I'm proposing. I pay off your $500 debt, all of it. You stay here for 2 years. You be my wife in name and in body. You run the house and you give me sons. At the end of 2 years, if you want to leave, you can. I'll give you $200 and safe passage anywhere you want to go. The boy comes with you or stays his choice by then. He'll be 7, old enough to decide. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread and spread. Evangeline felt Silas's hand tighten on her skirt, felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her chair. You're asking me to... She couldn't finish the sentence. I'm offering you safety, a roof, food, protection from Whitmore and anyone else who comes looking. In exchange, you give me what I can't get any other way without breaking the promise I made to Miriam. He gestured to the photograph on the wall. I won't love you, Mrs. Ashford. Can't. That part of me died with them, but I'll respect you. I'll provide for you and the boy. I'll keep my hands gentle and my word good. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. You want to buy me? The words came out harder than she intended. No. For the first time, emotion crept into his voice, something like offense. I want to hire you for a specific job that happens to require marriage. When the contract ends, you walk away free and clear with money in your pocket and no debt hanging over your head. That ain't buying, that's employment. Employment. She nearly laughed, would have, if her throat wasn't so tight. Most employment doesn't require what honesty about what's expected. Clear terms, a goddamn end date. Tobias moved closer, not threatening, but intense. I know what this sounds like. I know what you're thinking. But before you decide I'm some kind of monster, ask yourself this. What's your other option? Keep running until Whitmore catches you, sell yourself piece by piece in some saloon or boarding house until there's nothing left. Watch your boy grow up hungry and scared. Each question hit like a physical blow, because they were all things she'd already asked herself in the dark hours of night, when Silas slept and she lay awake calculating impossible mathematics. I could find work elsewhere, real work, for $15 a month. Tobias's laugh was bitter. That's $180 a year if you're lucky enough to find work that steady. Even if you spent nothing, and I mean nothing, on food, clothes, or keeping that boy alive, it'd take you damn near 3 years to pay off $500. You think Whitmore's going to wait 3 years? He was right. God help her, he was right, and they both knew it. Why me? Her voice came out small. Why not find some young girl who'd marry you proper, because young girls want love. They want romance and poetry and all those pretty lies people tell each other. I can't give that. Won't. But you're a widow running from a debt with a child to protect. You understand necessity. You understand that sometimes survival means making bargains you never thought you'd make. His eyes softened just slightly. I'm not asking you to love me, Evangeline. I'm asking you to work for me, to share my name and my bed and give me children in exchange for safety and security. It's honest work in its way, hard work, but honest. Silas stirred against her side, and Evangeline looked down at him, at his too pale face, his thin shoulders, the trust in his eyes that believed Mama would fix everything, would make it all right. She thought of Whitmore's letter, the last one that had found her in St. Louis. Stop running. When I catch you, and I will, it'll be worse for trying to hide. She thought of the nights sleeping in train stations, of watering down milk to make it last, of Silas crying from hunger he was too young to understand was punishment for his father's sins. She thought of the winter coming, of the impossibility of outrunning a man with resources while dragging a 5-year-old through the snow. If I agree, she stopped, swallowed. If I agree, what about Silas? You said he could choose to stay or go. But while I'm here, what happens to him? For the first time since entering the house, Tobias looked directly at the boy. His expression shifted, something almost like pain crossing his weathered features. I treat him like mine, like the son I should have had. I teach him what a man needs to know out here, horses, cattle, how to shoot, how to survive. I never raise a hand to him in anger, never let anyone else do it either. He eats what I eat, sleeps under a roof as solid as mine, gets schooling if you want it for him. He paused. And when you leave, if you leave, he goes with you or stays, no argument from me. I won't hold him hostage. That's not the kind of man I am. What kind of man are you, Mr. Brennan? The kind who keeps his word, even when it costs me. He moved back to the table, pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. I'll write it down, all of it, 2 years. $500 paid to Whitmore, room, board, and protection for you and the boy. At the end, $200 in safe passage. You sign it, I sign it, Paloma witnesses. Legal and binding. Evangeline watched him write in careful, precise letters, the hand of a man who'd learned to read late but learned it well. The scratch of pencil on paper was the only sound except for Silas's breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. When he finished, he slid the paper across to her. Before you decide, you should know something else. Tobias's voice had gone quieter, almost gentle. This ranch, this life, it's hard. The work will break your back and your hands. The sun will burn you. The winter will freeze you. There ain't nothing romantic or soft about any of it. But it's honest. And I swear to you on my wife's grave that I'll do right by you and the boy as long as you're under my roof. That's all I can promise. It'll have to be enough. Evangeline picked up the paper, read the words he'd written. The terms were exactly as he'd stated, clear, cold, transactional. Like a contract for livestock or land. Like anything except a marriage, but it was more than she had. More than she'd had in months. She looked at Silas, who'd finally found the courage to explore, moving slowly around the room with the careful steps of a child who'd learned to make himself small in strange places. He stopped at a window, peering out at the horses in the corral, and for just a moment his face held something like wonder. When was the last time her son had looked at anything with wonder? I need to know something, she said finally. This arrangement. When you say I'd be your wife in body, do you mean I mean exactly what marriage means." His voice was steady, but she caught something in his gaze, not cruelty, but a kind of resigned determination. "I need children, Mrs. Ashford. I can't get them any other way. I won't force you, won't hurt you. But yes, that's part of the agreement." Heat flooded her face, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "And if I can't, if I don't, if there are no children, then you've still fulfilled your part. You stayed. You tried. That's all I ask." He paused. "But I'll tell you true, I don't think that'll be a problem. You already got one healthy boy. Stands to reason you could give me more." The clinical nature of the discussion made her feel hollowed out, like she was negotiating the sale of her own body, which she supposed she was. The only difference was the honesty of it, the clear terms, the end date that meant this particular sale had an expiration. "I want something added." Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. Tobias raised an eyebrow. "What?" "That you'll never strike me or Silas. Never, no matter what. And if you break that promise, the contract is void, and you still pay the $500 to Whitmore." For a long moment he stared at her, and she wondered if she'd push too far, if he'd take offense at the implication. Then his face softened just slightly, and he picked up the pencil again. "Fair enough. Should have been in there from the start." He wrote the addition in the same careful hand, then pushed the paper back. Anything else? She thought of a dozen things: freedom to write letters, the right to keep her own clothes, promises about sleeping arrangements. But each addition felt like she was negotiating from a position of power she didn't actually have. She had $4.30, a $500 debt, and a 5-year-old who needed more than she could give him alone. "No, that's all." Tobias called for Paloma, who'd been tactfully absent during their discussion. The older woman returned, read the contract with eyes that gave away nothing, then signed her name at the bottom in a surprisingly elegant script. "Paloma Reyes, witness, June 14th, 1878, she said aloud as she wrote. Then she looked at Evangeline with something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning. "You sure about this, girl?" "No." Evangeline took the pencil in hands that had begun to shake again. "But I'm out of better options." She signed her name Evangeline Ashford, and the pen felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Tobias signed below hers T. Brennan. And just like that, it was done. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," Tobias said, rolling up the paper and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Talk to the preacher. We'll make it legal within the week. The ceremony won't be much, just words that need saying in front of God and a witness. That acceptable? Yes." What else could she say? Paloma, show Mrs. Ashford to the spare room, the one upstairs east-facing. He turned toward the door, then paused. "You'll eat with us tonight. All of us, me, the hands, everyone. They should meet you proper, know you're the new missus." "I'm not the missus yet," Evangeline said quietly. Tobias looked back at her, and for just a moment she saw something human in those storm-colored eyes, something tired and sad, and achingly alone. Near enough. "And Evangeline, welcome to the Barbie. I hope you won't regret this." Then he was gone back out into the June afternoon, leaving her standing in the house that would become her home, her prison, her salvation. She didn't know which yet. Paloma touched her arm gently. "Come on. I'll show you where you'll sleep. And later, I'll teach you how Mr. Brennan likes his coffee. Man's particular about his coffee." Evangeline followed the older woman up a narrow staircase, Silas's hand tight in hers, and tried not to think about what she'd just agreed to. Tried not to calculate the cost of survival in pieces of herself she'd have to give away. The room was small, but clean, with a window that looked east over the endless prairie. A bed, a washstand, a trunk at the foot for belongings she didn't have. It smelled of dust and disuse, like a place that had been waiting for someone to give it purpose. This was Abigail's room. Paloma ran a hand over the quilt on the bed, carefully stitched, faded now. "Miriam made this before the baby came, spent all winter on it. After they died, Mr. Brennan locked this room up for near 7 years, only opened it last month like he knew someone was coming." He loved them, his wife and daughter. Loved them. Paloma's laugh was soft, sad. Child, he worshipped them. Miriam was 17 when they married, pretty as spring and sweet as honey. She gentled all the hard edges the war had put in him, and Abigail Lord, that little girl, had him wrapped around her tiny finger. When they died, when he had to bury them both in the same day, something in him died too. I watched it happen, watched the light go out and never come back. Evangeline sat on the bed, pulled Silas onto her lap. Then why this? Why want children again if it hurt him so much to lose them? Because the ranch needs heirs. Because a man works himself to death for something he wants it to matter after he's gone. And because— Paloma hesitated, then continued, because maybe part of him hopes that new life will fill some of the emptiness, even if he won't admit it, even if he's too scared to hope. He said he won't love me. I know what he said. I also know that man been alone so long, he forgot what it feels like to have someone waiting when he comes home. Paloma smiled, sad and knowing. You be patient, be kind, be strong. You might surprise both of you, but don't mistake his hardness for cruelty. He's protecting himself the only way he knows how. I don't want to be loved. The words came out harder than Evangeline intended. I had love. It got me bruises and debts and widowhood. I'll take respect and safety over love any day. Paloma's smile turned knowing. We'll see, girl, we'll see. That night, Evangeline sat at the long table, surrounded by men who smelled of sweat and leather, and looked at her with everything from curiosity to suspicion. Tobias introduced her simply as Mrs. Ashford, who'll be the new housekeeper and my wife come Sunday. If the men found this announcement strange, and several clearly did, they kept their thoughts behind their teeth. Cowboys learned early not to question the boss. The foreman, a grizzled man named Marcus Thompson, who looked to be in his early 50s, nodded respectfully. He had the weathered face of someone who'd spent 40 years under the Texas sun, and when he spoke his voice was gravelly but kind. Welcome to the Bar B, ma'am. You need anything, you let me or the boys know. He had a habit of calling everyone son, she'd later learn, and chewed tobacco constantly, though never in the house out of respect for Paloma. The youngest of the group, a sandy-haired cowboy who couldn't be more than 20, grinned at Silas. He had an easy smile and whistled constantly while he worked, filling the ranch with music. You like horses, little man? Silas, who'd been silent all through the meal, finally found his voice. I never rode one. Well, we'll fix that right quick. I'm Billy Reeves. I'll teach you everything you need to know about horses, long as your mama says it's okay. Billy had the enthusiasm of youth and hadn't yet learned to hide his emotions behind a cowboy's stoic mask. Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes at the casual kindness, at the way these rough men were already making space for her son. That would be fine. Thank you. There was Luke Foster, too, a man of 48 who rarely spoke, but smiled at horses more than people. He'd been with the ranch longest after Marcus, and had a gentle way with animals that Silas would come to admire. Tobias sat at the head of the table eating methodically, saying little. But she caught him watching her sometimes, those sharp eyes, assessing, calculating, trying to figure out what he'd brought into his house. She wondered the same thing about him. After dinner, after the men had drifted back to the bunkhouse, and Silas had fallen asleep almost before his head hit the pillow, Evangeline stood at her window and looked out at the darkening prairie. Somewhere out there, Chase Whitmore was still hunting, still coming. But for the first time in months, she felt something like the possibility of standing still, of not running, of making a last stand, even if it meant surrendering pieces of herself she'd never thought to bargain with. A knock on her door made her turn. Tobias stood in the hallway, still dressed, a lantern in his hand, throwing shadows across his weathered face. Wanted to make sure you had everything you need. His voice was gruff, uncomfortable, like a man unused to playing host. We're fine. Thank you. He nodded, but didn't leave. I know what you must think of me, what this must look like. What do I think? That I'm using you, taking advantage of your desperation. Evangeline considered lying, offering some polite deflection, but they'd made a bargain built on honesty, even if it was brutal. "Aren't you?" "Maybe." He shifted the lantern, and the light caught the silver in his hair. "But you're using me too, for protection, for safety, for a place to stop running. We're both getting something we need from this arrangement. That makes us even, seems to me." Even. She tasted the word. Is that what marriage is supposed to be? A transaction where both sides come out even? I don't know what marriage is supposed to be anymore. For the first time she heard exhaustion in his voice, a weariness that went bone deep. "I only know what I can offer. It ain't hearts and flowers, Evangeline. It's a roof and regular meals and my word that I'll do right by you. Maybe that's not much, but it's real. It's more real than most of the pretty promises people make each other." He was right, and she hated that he was right. William had promised her the world, had courted her with poetry and flowers and declarations of eternal devotion. And then he'd shown her that love could wear a fist, that pretty words meant nothing when the bottle was empty and the gambling debts came due. "I'll see you in the morning." Tobias turned to go, then paused. "One more thing. That man Whitmore. When he comes, and he will come, you tell me immediately. You don't try to handle it yourself. You don't try to protect me from it. You tell me, and I deal with it. That's the bargain. You understand?" "Yes." "Good. Sleep well, Evangeline." He left, and she was alone again in the room that had belonged to a dead child wearing a dead woman's charity, preparing to become wife to a man who'd promised her everything except his heart. And somehow, impossibly, she did sleep, deeply and dreamlessly, for the first time since William had died, and the debts had come due and running had become the only language she knew. When she woke to the sound of roosters crowing and men already moving in the pre-dawn darkness, she had 3 days left before she became Evangeline Brennan. 3 days before the bargain became binding. 3 days before she learned whether she'd saved herself or sold herself. The difference, she was beginning to understand, might be smaller than she'd ever imagined. The wedding took place on Sunday morning in the small church at Red River, with fewer witnesses than a funeral and less celebration than a hanging. Evangeline wore the only dress she owned that wasn't stained from travel, a simple gray cotton that had seen better years, and a woman who'd worn it with more hope. Paloma had pressed it as best she could, had even woven a few wildflowers into Evangeline's dark auburn hair, though the gesture felt more like dressing a sacrifice than a bride. Tobias arrived in a clean shirt, his jaw freshly shaved, smelling of soap instead of horses for once. He'd slicked his hair back with water that was already drying in the late June warmth, and when he looked at her across the church steps, his expression was careful, neutral, a man attending to necessary business. The Reverend was an old man with kind eyes who'd clearly performed this particular ceremony enough times to recognize a marriage of convenience when he saw one. He kept the words brief, perfunctory, asking the required questions in a voice that suggested he'd long since stopped expecting honest answers. "Do you, Tobias Brennan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." No hesitation, no emotion. Like signing a contract, which Evangeline supposed was exactly what this was. "And do you, Evangeline Ashford, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" She looked at Tobias, at the hard lines of his face, the storm-gray eyes, the shoulders that carried 8 years of grief like a yoke he'd never set down. She thought of Silas waiting back at the ranch with Paloma. She thought of Chase Whitmore somewhere east of here, getting closer with every passing day. She thought of survival and what it cost and whether her soul was worth $500. "I do." The Reverend pronounced them man and wife with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grain report. Tobias didn't kiss her, didn't even touch her, except to sign the marriage certificate with his careful, practiced hand, then watch as she added her own signature below. Mrs. Evangeline Brennan. The name looked foreign, like it belonged to someone else. They rode back to the ranch in Tobias's wagon, sitting side by side, but not touching the space between them filled with everything they weren't saying. The morning sun climbed higher and dust rose in clouds behind the wheels, coating everything in a fine red powder that tasted like the end of things. "I'll send a telegram to Whitmore tomorrow," Tobias said, finally breaking the silence that had stretched since they'd left the church. "Let him know the debt's been paid. Wire him the money through the bank in Fort Worth. Should reach him within the week. Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but what else was there to say? After that, he's got no legal claim on you. You're my wife now. Under Texas law, your debts before marriage are your debts. But I'm paying them, which makes them mine, and I protect what's mine. There it was again, that word. Mine. Like she was property, livestock, something he'd acquired and now had to maintain. She should have been angry, should have felt diminished. Instead, she felt something disturbingly close to relief. Being owned, it turned out, was less terrifying than being hunted. The ranch came into view, and Silas was waiting on the porch, practically vibrating with barely contained energy. He'd been allowed to help Billy with the morning chores, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, and his face was bright, with the kind of joy Evangeline hadn't seen in months. "Mama?" "Billy let me throw grain to the chickens, and one of them pecked my hand, but it didn't hurt much, and there's a baby calf in the barn that's only 3 days old, and Billy says maybe I can help feed it tomorrow if Mr. Brennan says it's okay." The words tumbled out in a breathless rush, and Evangeline felt her throat tighten. This was what she'd sold herself for. Not safety for herself, but the chance for her son to be a child again, to run and play, and not wake up frightened in the night wondering where they'd have to flee next. "We'll ask Mr. Brennan," she said, smoothing his hair, and then corrected herself, the words strange on her tongue. We'll ask Tobias." Tobias had climbed down from the wagon and was already unhitching the horses with the efficient movements of a man who'd performed the task 10,000 times. But he paused, looked at Silas with an expression that might have been the beginning of fondness if he'd allowed himself such things. "You can help with the calf," he said. "But Billy teaches you proper. You listen to what he says, you move slow around the animals, and you never go in the barn alone. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Silas was already running toward the barn, his small legs churning up dust. "Not now," Tobias called after him. "After supper. Animals eat on a schedule, boy. You'll learn that soon enough." Silas skidded to a halt, deflated but obedient, and trudged back toward the house. Evangeline watched this small interaction, the setting of boundaries, the gruff kindness, the way Tobias was already teaching her son the rhythms of ranch life, and felt something shift in her chest. This man who claimed he couldn't love, who'd buried his heart with his wife and daughter, was already making space for a 5-year-old boy who wasn't his blood, would never be his heir. Maybe she thought there were different kinds of love. Or maybe there were just different words for the same desperate need not to be alone. That night, after the supper dishes had been cleared and Silas had been put to bed in the small room adjacent to hers, Evangeline stood in front of the mirror in what was now her bedroom, the room that had been Miriam's, that still smelled faintly of lavender and loss. She'd changed into her nightgown, a worn cotton thing that had been washed so many times it was soft as silk, but thin enough to see through in the right light. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, dark auburn catching the lamplight, and her hands shook as she tried to braid it. This was her wedding night. The thought made her feel sick and terrified and resigned all at once. Tobias had been clear about his expectations. She'd agreed to them. This was part of the bargain, part of the employment, part of the transaction that would give her 2 years of safety in exchange for— A knock on the door stopped her thoughts. "Come in." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Tobias entered, still dressed in his work clothes, though he'd removed his boots. He closed the door behind him with a quiet click that sounded like a lock tumbling, like the sealing of something irrevocable. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the small room, this woman and this man who were strangers bound by legal documents and desperate circumstances. "I want you to understand something," Tobias said, finally, his voice low and rough. "I know what you must be thinking, what you must be feeling, and I want to be clear, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to force you. If you need time, we have time. The contract says 2 years. We don't have to start everything tonight." Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected mercy of it. "But you said you needed—" "I need sons, yes. But I'm not an animal, Evangeline. I'm not going to take you like one." He moved closer, and she fought the instinct to step back. "We're married now, legal and binding. That means we have time to learn each other, to make this as bearable as we can." "Bearable," she almost laughed. "Is that what we're aiming for? It's better than most marriages I've seen." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His hand was calloused rough from work, but his touch was careful. "I know I'm not what you wanted. I know this whole situation is about as far from a fairy tale as you can get, but I'm trying in my way to do right by you." I know, and she did know, could feel it in the space he was giving her, in the way he'd looked at Silas with something like protectiveness, in the telegram he'd send tomorrow that would free her from Whitmore's reach. "I know you are. So tonight we sleep, you in your bed, me in mine. We'll figure out the rest as we go. You have another bed?" She'd assumed, had been preparing herself for down the hall, my room. "I haven't slept in here since Miriam died." He looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time in years, and pain flickered across his face. "Couldn't bear to. But I thought you'd want privacy, especially with the boy next door, so I'll keep my distance until you're ready for me not to." The relief was so intense it made her knees weak. "Thank you." He nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "Evangeline, I meant what I said in the contract. I'll keep my hands gentle and my word good. You don't have to be afraid of me. Whatever else this is, whatever else we are to each other, you don't have to be afraid." Then he was gone, and she was alone with her trembling hands and her racing heart, and the knowledge that her husband had just given her something she hadn't expected and didn't know how to name. Respect, maybe, or decency, or maybe just the kind of tired kindness that came from a man who'd hurt enough to understand suffering when he saw it. She slept that night in Miriam's bed, wrapped in a quilt made by a dead woman's hands, and dreamed of nothing at all. The days that followed established a rhythm that was almost normal, if normal could describe a marriage built on contracts and necessity. Evangeline woke before dawn to help Paloma prepare breakfast for the men, mountains of eggs and bacon biscuits hot from the oven coffee strong enough to resurrect the dead. The cowboys ate like they were starving, which Paloma assured her they basically were after working 12-hour days in the relentless Texas summer. After breakfast, there were dishes to wash bread, to bake vegetables, to tend in the small garden behind the house. Evangeline's hands, soft from Boston drawing rooms, and the genteel poverty that had followed William's death blistered and bled. Paloma showed her how to wrap them, how to push through the pain, how to develop the calluses that would eventually make the work bearable. "You're doing good," the older woman said one morning, watching Evangeline knead bread with hands that had learned the rhythm, if not the ease. Most city women quit after the first week, cry and carry on about how hard it is. "I don't have the luxury of quitting." Evangeline punched down the dough, feeling a savage satisfaction in the violence of it. And crying never solved anything. "You got spine, I'll give you that." Miriam had that too, under all her sweetness. Paloma's eyes grew thoughtful. "Mr. Brennan needs someone strong, someone who won't break under the weight of all he carries." Evangeline didn't respond. She focused on the bread, on the simple mechanics of survival, and tried not to think about the weight of expectations she might never be able to meet. But time was something Evangeline wasn't sure she had. 2 weeks after the wedding, trouble arrived in the form of a stranger. Marcus came to the house during the afternoon, his weathered face troubled. He found Tobias mending fence near the barn and spoke in low tones, but Evangeline, who'd been hanging laundry, caught enough to feel ice form in her stomach. "Stranger in town yesterday, boss. Rough-looking fellow asking questions about a woman matching the missus's description. Auburn hair, green eyes, traveling with a young boy. Might be calling herself Ashford." Tobias went very still. You talked to him? Told him lots of women in Texas, lots of boys too. Suggested he try the sheriff if he had business with someone specific. Marcus spat tobacco juice into the dust. He rode out after that, but not before studying the ranch real careful-like. Man had the look of someone who gets paid to find people. He say who hired him. Didn't ask, didn't tell, but I'd wager my last dollar we ain't seen the last of him. That night, Marcus reported the encounter in full to Tobias, with Evangeline summoned after Silas had been put to bed. They sat in the small office off the main room, Tobias behind a desk scattered with ledgers and bills of sale. Evangeline in a chair across from him, the lamp between them throwing shadows that made Tobias's face look carved from stone. "It's Whitmore," Evangeline said, hating the fear that crept into her voice. "He sent someone to find me." "Probably." Tobias's jaw tightened. "You got the telegram I sent telling him the debt was paid. I saw you send it. But Chase Whitmore isn't the type to let go just because the money's been settled. He's more about control than cash. He doesn't like losing what he considers his." Something dangerous flickered in those storm-colored eyes. "Then he's going to learn real quick that you're not his to control anymore. You're mine." He said it with such finality, such absolute certainty, that Evangeline felt her breath catch. "And I protect what belongs to me. What are you going to do?" "What I have to. Protect my wife, protect my home." He stood moved to the window that looked out over the darkened ranch. "I fought in the war, Evangeline, Shiloh, Antietam. I've killed men before. If Whitmore or his hired thugs come onto my land with intentions of taking what's mine, they'll learn. I haven't forgotten how." The casual mention of killing should have frightened her. Instead, she felt a fierce, unexpected gratitude. No one had ever stood between her and danger before. William had been the danger. Her family had turned away when the debts came due. The law had been a joke twisted by Whitmore's money and connections. But this man, this stranger she'd married for safety, was prepared to kill for her. "I don't want you to have to do that," she said quietly. "I don't want anyone to die because of me." "Then you should have stayed in Boston and let Whitmore have you." His voice was harsh, but when he turned from the window, his gaze was almost gentle. "You're here now. You're my responsibility. I don't take that lightly." Marcus said the man rode away. "Maybe that's the end of it." "Maybe." Tobias didn't sound convinced. "But we'll be ready either way. I'm doubling the watch, and I want you armed when I'm not in the house. Can you shoot?" "William showed me once, but I never—" "We'll fix that. Tomorrow you learn proper." It wasn't a suggestion. Over the next weeks, Evangeline threw herself into learning everything Paloma could teach her and everything Tobias demanded she know for survival. She mastered the art of keeping a fire at exactly the right temperature for baking hot enough to crisp the biscuits, but not burn them cool enough that the bread could rise without collapsing. She learned to kill and pluck chickens without flinching, though the first time made her sick, and she had to hide it from the men. She memorized how each of the 8 cowboys took their coffee, Marcus, Black, and Strong Billy, with 2 sugars, Luke barely warm enough to drink. But it was the shooting lessons with Tobias that changed something between them. He took her out to the west pasture every evening after supper when the worst of the day's heat had passed and the light turned everything gold. He'd set up targets, old bottles cans, eventually a proper paper target Billy painted on a board. "Feet shoulder width apart," Tobias would say, standing behind her close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "Weight forward. The recoil's going to want to push you back. You let it, and your next shot will be wild." His hands would adjust her stance, his voice low and patient in her ear. "Breathe in, let half of it out. Find your sight picture. Squeeze, don't pull. The gun going off should surprise you." The first week she couldn't hit anything. Her hands shook too much. Her breathing was all wrong, and the noise of the gunshot made her flinch every time. But Tobias never lost patience, never raised his voice. just guided her through the mechanics again and again, until her body learned what her mind couldn't quite grasp. By the third week, she could hit the bottles more often than she missed them. "Good," Tobias said one evening after she'd shattered 3 in a row. There was something like pride in his voice. "You're getting the feel of it. Another month, you'll be dangerous." "I don't want to be dangerous," Evangeline said, lowering the pistol. "I want to be safe. In this world, one leads to the other." He took the gun from her, reloaded it with the practiced ease of long familiarity. "You did good today. Real good." The praise warmed her more than it should have. She learned the ranch too, its rhythms and routines, the sound of cattle lowing at dawn, the way the windmill creaked different notes depending on which way the wind blew. She learned that Tobias rose before the sun and often didn't come in until after dark, that he pushed himself with a relentlessness that bordered on punishing, like he was trying to outrun something that had no physical form. And she learned Silas's laughter, which had been absent so long she'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. Billy Reeves had taken the boy under his wing, teaching him to ride on an old mare, gentle as a rocking chair, showing him how to throw a rope and muck out stalls, and all the 1,000 small tasks that made a ranch run. The young cowboy whistled while he worked, filling the air with melodies that made even hard labor seem lighter. Silas followed him everywhere, chattering with the pent-up words of a child who'd been told to be quiet for too long. But it was Tobias who taught him the important things. One evening, Evangeline looked out the kitchen window to see her husband and her son standing by the corral. Tobias's large hand guiding Silas's small one as he showed the boy how to properly approach a horse slow and steady, letting the animal smell you, reading its body language for signs of fear or aggression. Silas was listening with the intense concentration of a child, desperate for a father's approval, and Tobias was speaking with a patience she hadn't known he possessed. "That's good," she heard Tobias say. "You're a natural with animals, boy. They trust you. That's a rare thing. Did you have a boy?" Silas's question was innocent, but Evangeline saw Tobias stiffen. "Billy said you had a little girl who died." For a long moment Tobias didn't answer. Then, "I did. Her name was Abigail. She would have been about your age now if the fever hadn't taken her." "Do you miss her?" "Every day." "I miss my pa sometimes," Silas said, then added with the brutal honesty of childhood, "Even though he was mean, does that make me bad?" "No." Tobias crouched down to Silas's level, and Evangeline could see the pain etched in the lines of his face. Missing someone who hurt you don't make you bad. It makes you human. And for what it's worth, your pa was a fool. Any man who'd be mean to a boy like you wasn't worth the name father. "Are you going to be my pa now?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Evangeline held her breath, waiting. "I'm your ma's husband," Tobias said carefully. "That makes me responsible for you, makes me duty-bound to teach you right from wrong, keep you safe, help you grow into a good man. I can't replace the pay you lost Silas. But I can promise you this, I'll never raise a hand to you in anger. I'll never make you afraid, and I'll always tell you the truth even when it's hard. That enough for you?" Silas thought about this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old weighing something important. Then he nodded. "Can I call you Pa anyway? Just to try it out?" Evangeline saw Tobias's throat work, saw him blink hard against something that might have been tears if he'd allowed himself such things. "Yeah, boy, you can call me Pa." That night, after Silas had gone to bed, still glowing from the day's triumphs, Tobias found Evangeline in the kitchen where she was finishing the last of the dishes. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you did today, with Silas." "Didn't do anything special, just talked to the boy. You gave him something he's never had. A man who wasn't afraid of him, wasn't annoyed by him, actually wanted to teach him things." She dried her hands on her apron, turned to face him. William hated that Silas asked questions. Used to tell him to shut up, to stop being a burden. You're different." William was a fool in more ways than one then. Tobias moved into the room, and she could smell the familiar scent of him, horses and leather, and the particular clean sweat of hard work. The boy's bright, eager to learn. Be ashamed to waste that. He called you Pa. I know. Something passed over Tobias's face, complicated, painful, almost hopeful. I probably should have told him not to, kept things clearer. But I couldn't. He looked at me with those eyes, and I just couldn't. Why not? Because I remember what it felt like to want a father's approval. My own pa died when I was 6. After that it was just me and my ma, and she did her best. But there are things a boy needs to learn from a man. I swore if I ever had sons I'd be present. I'd teach them. I'd make sure they knew they mattered. His voice had gone rough. I didn't get to keep that promise with Abigail, but maybe I can keep it with Silas. He's not your son. Not by blood, but he's living under my roof, eating my food, learning my trade. That makes him mine in the ways that matter. He paused. Besides, your contract says if he wants to stay after 2 years, he can. If I'm going to teach him how to be a man, might as well start now. Evangeline felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen since the day she'd signed the contract, since the day she'd reduced herself to a transaction. This man who claimed he couldn't love, who'd sworn off feeling anything for anyone, was already halfway to loving her son. And maybe she thought with something like terror, halfway to something else too. Tobias, she started, but he held up a hand. Don't. Whatever you're about to say, just don't. We both know what this is. We both know what it's not. The boy makes things easier, that's all. Gives me someone to teach. Gives me purpose beyond working myself to death, that's all it is. But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things that couldn't be said, weighted with the ghost of Miriam and the shadow of William, and all the reasons they'd both sworn off hope. Then Tobias cleared his throat, stepped back. It's late. You should get some rest. Tomorrow's Sunday, you can sleep in if you want. Paloma can handle breakfast for once. All right. She moved to pass him, but he caught her arm gently, carefully. Evangeline, about Whitmore's man. If he comes back, if anyone comes asking about you, you tell me immediately. You don't try to handle it yourself. You don't try to protect me from it. You understand? Yes. Good. But he didn't let go. His hand stayed on her arm, warm through the thin fabric of her dress, and his eyes searched her face like he was looking for something he didn't know how to name. You're doing good here, better than I expected. The men respect you. Paloma says you're learning fast. And Silas is happy. That counts for something. What counts for you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. What do you mean? What would make you happy, Tobias? What would make this more than just bearable? He was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I don't know if I remember how to be happy. I remember what it looked like, tasted like, felt like, but actually feeling it myself. He shook his head. That part of me died with them. Best I can hope for now is useful, productive. Maybe at the end of the day being so tired I can sleep without dreaming. That's not living. That's just existing. Maybe, but it's all I've got. He released her arm, stepped back into the shadows. Good night, Evangeline. Good night. She climbed the stairs to her room, where Silas was already asleep in the adjacent space, his small chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of childhood. She stood in the doorway watching him for a long moment, this boy who'd called Tobias Pa, with such hope in his voice, who was learning to be a child again in this hard, unforgiving place. And she thought about the man downstairs who claimed he couldn't love, who claimed he was just fulfilling a contract, just getting what he needed from a business arrangement. But she'd seen the way he looked at Silas when he thought no one was watching, had heard the gentleness in his voice when he explained how to read a horse's mood, had felt the careful respect in the way he'd given her time, given her space, given her every courtesy he could despite the brutal practicality of their arrangement. This was a man who protected what he claimed with a fierceness that bordered on holy, a man who kept his promises even when they cost him. A man who was so busy building walls around his heart that he didn't notice the cracks forming in the foundation. And Evangeline, who'd sworn she was done with love, who'd learned that pretty words meant nothing and promises were just lies waiting to hatch, felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Not love, not yet. But maybe the beginning of trust, of respect, of the kind of partnership that didn't need poetry to be real. She undressed for bed, blew out the lamp, and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Cattle lowing in the distance, the windmill's endless creak, the scurry of mice in the walls. And somewhere down the hall, a man who couldn't sleep, who wouldn't let himself dream, who was learning, despite himself, that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very prisons that keep us alone. 3 weeks into the marriage, everything changed. Chase Whitmore came to Texas. He didn't come quietly, didn't come alone. He arrived in Red River with 3 hired guns and a lawyer clutching a stack of papers that he claimed proved Evangeline's marriage was fraudulent, that the debt was still owed, that she needed to return to Boston to face criminal charges for theft and fraud. It was all lies, of course. Elaborate, expensive lies backed by a man who'd built his fortune on breaking people and didn't like losing what he considered his property. Word reached the ranch before Whitmore did a telegram from the sheriff in Red River, a man named Tom Cartwright who'd fought with Tobias at Shiloh and still counted him as a friend. Whitmore's making noise about taking your wife, claims you married her under false pretenses to defraud him of legal debt collection. He's got a judge in his pocket back east, willing to sign extradition papers. Thought you should know. Tom. Tobias read the telegram twice, his face going harder with each pass. Then he called for Marcus, and Billy sent them to gather the rest of the hands. Within an hour, 8 cowboys stood in the main room of the house, armed and waiting. Evangeline stood at the edge of the gathering, Silas pressed close to her side, watching her husband transform into something she'd only glimpsed before, a soldier, a fighter, a man who'd survived a war and wouldn't be intimidated by hired guns and corrupt lawyers. "Here's the situation," Tobias said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "My wife has a man from Boston trying to claim she owes him money and property. The debt's been paid, the marriage is legal. But he's not the type to let facts get in the way of what he wants. He's in Red River now with guns and a lawyer. He'll likely come here within the day." "What do you want us to do, boss?" Marcus asked, his weathered face set. "I want you armed and ready. I want someone on watch at all times. If Whitmore or his men set foot on this property with intent to take my wife, you stop them, legally, if possible. Otherwise, if necessary." His pale eyes swept over the assembled men. "I'm not asking you to kill for me, but I am asking you to stand with me. Any man who's not comfortable with that can draw his pay and leave no hard feelings." Not one man moved. "We're with you, boss," Billy said, and the others nodded agreement. Luke Foster, silent as always, checked his rifle with quiet efficiency. Tobias's expression softened just slightly. "Thank you. Now get to your positions. And someone ride to the Mackenzie Ranch, let Sarah know what's happening. If things go south, I want Paloma and the boy somewhere safe." As the men dispersed, Tobias turned to Evangeline. "Pack a bag for you and Silas. Light just what you can't leave behind. If this goes bad, you're going to the Mackenzie place with Paloma." "No." The word came out stronger than she felt. "Evangeline, number 1, I'm not running anymore. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." She moved closer into the space that had always been his and looked up at him with all the determination she possessed. "You said I was yours to protect. Well, you're mine to stand by. That's how marriage works, isn't it? Even marriages like ours." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of something deeper. "You don't know what you're asking. If Whitmore gets his hands on you, he won't. Because you won't let him. Because we won't let him." She reached out, placed her hand on his arm, felt the muscle tense beneath her touch. "I trust you, Tobias. Maybe that makes me a fool, but I do. So I'm staying." For a long moment he looked at her, really looked like he was seeing her for the first time. Then he covered her hand with his own, calloused and warm and steady. "Then you stay close to me. You do exactly what I say when I say it. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Understood. Good." He squeezed her hand once, then released it, already moving toward the door. "Paloma, take the boy upstairs. Keep him away from the windows. Come on, mijijo," Paloma said gently, reaching for Silas. But Silas pulled away, ran to Tobias instead. "Pa is someone trying to hurt Mama." Tobias crouched down, brought himself eye level with the boy. "Yes, but I'm not going to let them. You understand me? I protect what's mine, and you and your mama are mine now. Promise, promise." Silas threw his arms around Tobias's neck, and for just a moment the hard man softened completely, one hand coming up to cradle the boy's head with a tenderness that made Evangeline's throat close. "I love you, Pa," Silas whispered. Evangeline saw Tobias's eyes squeeze shut, saw his jaw clench against emotion he wouldn't allow himself to show. When he spoke, his voice was rough as gravel. "I know, son. Now go with Paloma. Be brave for your mama." As Paloma led Silas upstairs, Tobias stood, and Evangeline saw what Whitmore's threat had done, had stripped away the last pretense that this marriage was just business, just a transaction, just a contract to be fulfilled and forgotten. This was his family now, and Tobias Brennan, who had sworn off love and feeling and any kind of vulnerability, was preparing to kill to keep it. They came at sunset, when the light was failing and shadows stretched long across the land. 4 riders approaching from the east road. Whitmore in front, recognizable even at a distance by the expensive cut of his clothes and the arrogant set of his shoulders. Tobias stood on the porch rifle, cradled in his arms, Marcus and Billy flanking him. The other hands were positioned strategically, 2 in the barn, 2 by the corral. Luke Foster on the roof of the house itself with his favored long gun. They'd turned the ranch into a fortress in the space of hours, and Evangeline understood why, because when a man like Tobias Brennan decided to stand his ground, he did it absolutely. She watched from the window where he'd ordered her to stay, her own hands clutching one of Tobias's pistols, smaller than the rifle, easier for her to manage, though she had no idea if she'd actually be able to pull the trigger if it came to that. The riders stopped 50 feet from the house, just close enough to talk, but far enough to give them room to draw weapons. Whitmore dismounted, and Evangeline felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. He looked the same as he always had, handsome, in a cold way, his face all sharp angles and harder edges, his eyes the flat gray of stone. "Brennan," Whitmore called out, his voice carrying across the space between them. "I'm here for my property. Send out Evangeline Ashford, and there won't be any trouble. Her name's Evangeline Brennan now. She's my wife. And she's not going anywhere." Tobias's voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath. "Your marriage is fraudulent. I have papers. I don't care what papers you have. I care about Texas law, which says a woman's debts before marriage are her debts. I paid them. $500 wired to your account in Boston 3 weeks ago. You received it. You cashed it. The debt's satisfied." Whitmore's smile was cold. "The debt's satisfied. But there are other matters, criminal matters, theft, fraud, conspiracy to defraud a lawful creditor. Evangeline committed crimes in Massachusetts. I have extradition papers signed by a judge. She needs to return to face those charges. Then she'll face them in a Texas court, where she has a right to defend herself with a lawyer of her choosing in front of a judge who isn't in your pocket." Tobias shifted his rifle slightly, a subtle reminder of its presence. "But she's not going anywhere with you, not today, not ever." "You're making a mistake." Whitmore's voice hardened. "I have the law on my side. You have a piece of paper from a corrupt judge 2,000 miles from here. I have 8 armed men who work for me and a sheriff in Red River who knows me well enough to ask questions before he acts." Tobias took a step forward, and his men moved with him, a coordinated show of force. "So here's what's going to happen, Whitmore. You're going to turn around. You're going to ride back to Red River. You're going to get on the next train east, and you're going to forget Evangeline Ashford ever existed. And if I don't, then you're going to learn that Texas is a long way from Boston, and men disappear out here all the time. Cattle drives gone wrong, riding accidents, run-ins with the kind of people who don't care much for city lawyers and their hired guns. The threat was delivered in the same calm tone, but there was no mistaking its sincerity. Your choice. One of Whitmore's hired guns, a lean man with the look of someone who killed for a living, started to reach for his weapon. But Marcus had his rifle up and aimed before the man's hand reached leather. "I wouldn't," Marcus said quietly, tobacco juice staining his teeth. The tableau held for a long, breathless moment. 4 men against 8. Hired loyalty against earned respect. The kind of standoff that could end in blood or could end in backing down depending on who blinked first. Whitmore blinked. "This isn't over, Brennan. I have resources. I have connections. You're nobody, just some rancher in the middle of nowhere. You think you can stand against me? I know I can, because you're right about one thing: I am nobody. I'm just a rancher. But this is my land, that's my house, and that's my wife. You threaten what belongs to me, you find out exactly how far a nobody's willing to go." Tobias's voice dropped lower. "Now get off my property before I stop being civilized about this." For a moment, Evangeline thought Whitmore would push. It would force the confrontation into violence. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his own weapon. But then he looked at the armed men surrounding him, at the determination in Tobias's eyes, at the ranch itself that had become a fortress. And he smiled. It was a terrible smile, full of promise and malice. "You haven't won, Brennan. You've just delayed. I'll be back. With proper authorities. With federal marshals if I have to. And when I come back, your little show of force won't mean a damn thing." "Looking forward to it," Tobias said. "Now ride." Whitmore mounted his horse with deliberate slowness, making it clear he was leaving by choice, not compulsion. His hired guns followed suit, their faces carefully blank. As they turned their horses, Whitmore looked past Tobias to the window where Evangeline stood, and when their eyes met, she saw everything she needed to know. This wasn't over. This would never be over until one of them was destroyed. Then they were gone, riding back toward Red River in the failing light, and the tension that had held everyone rigid broke like a snapped wire. "Billy Luke, follow them," Tobias ordered. "Stay far enough back they don't see you, but make sure they actually leave town. Report back tonight." As the 2 cowboys mounted up, Evangeline finally left her post at the window, moving out onto the porch where Tobias still stood, rifle in hand, watching the horizon swallow the riders. "He'll be back," she said quietly. "I know. With more men, with legal authority, with—" "I know." Tobias finally looked at her, and she saw exhaustion in his face, the weight of what he'd just done settling onto shoulders already carrying too much. "But not today. Today you're safe. Today Silas is safe. Today we stood our ground and won. Tomorrow we'll deal with tomorrow." Tobias. She wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him what it meant that he'd stood between her and the man who'd hunted her across half the country. But the words felt too small for the enormity of it. He seemed to understand anyway. "Come here," he said, and it wasn't a command, it was something else, an invitation, a request. She went to him, and his arm came around her shoulders, pulling her against his side with a gentleness that belied the violence he'd been ready to commit minutes before. She fit there, she realized, in the space between his arm and his chest, sheltered and protected, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, safe. "Thank you," she whispered against the fabric of his shirt. "You're my wife," he said simply. What else would I do? But it was more than that, and they both knew it. This wasn't just about duty or contracts or legal obligations. This was about a man who'd lost everything learning that he had something left to lose. And a woman who'd sworn off trusting anyone learning that maybe, just maybe, she could trust this. They stood there as the sun finished setting, painting the sky in colors that had no names, And Evangeline felt something shift between them, something that had been building since the day she'd signed the contract, since the first time he'd looked at her with respect instead of just transaction. Not love, not yet, but something that could become love if they were brave enough to let it. "We should tell Silas everything's all right," she said finally. "Yeah." But Tobias didn't move, didn't release her from the circle of his arm. "Evangeline, I need you to understand something. That man Whitmore, he's not going to stop. He's going to come back with everything he can bring. And when he does, it's going to get ugly, possibly violent, possibly, I know. If you want to leave, if you want to take the $200 now and go somewhere he can't find you, no." She turned in his arms, looked up at him with all the determination she had left. "I'm staying. I'm fighting. We made a bargain, Tobias. 2 years. I intend to keep it. Even if it means, even if." She reached up, touched his face with fingers that no longer trembled, and felt him go still under her hand. "You've given me more in 3 weeks than anyone else gave me in 3 years of marriage. You've protected my son. You've kept your word. You've made me feel like maybe I'm worth protecting. So yes, even if." Something broke in his eyes, some wall he'd been holding against her, against feeling, against the possibility of caring again. His hand came up to cover hers, where it rested against his cheek, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he could no longer hide. "Then we fight together. Whatever comes, whatever it takes." He paused. "And Evangeline, you are worth protecting, worth fighting for. Don't ever think different." Then he did something he'd never done before, something she'd never expected. He lowered his head and kissed her, not the perfunctory press of lips at their wedding, not the mechanical touch of a man fulfilling a contract. This was real, desperate and gentle and full of everything he couldn't say with words. It tasted like promise and danger and the beginning of something that terrified them both. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Evangeline saw in his eyes what she felt in her own chest, the knowledge that they'd crossed a line they could never uncross, that this arrangement had become something neither of them had planned for. "I should," Tobias started, but she pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't apologize. Don't take it back. Just let it be what it is." He nodded, and they stood there in the growing darkness, holding each other against the storm that was coming, against the violence and the fear and the impossible odds. And somewhere upstairs, a 5-year-old boy slept peacefully, dreaming of horses and fathers who kept their promises, unaware that the world was about to test exactly how much one man would sacrifice for a family he'd never meant to love. The telegram arrived 3 days after Whitmore's retreat, delivered by a boy from Red River whose horse was lathered with sweat from hard riding. Tobias read it on the porch while the late July sun beat down merciless as judgment, and Evangeline watched his face turn to stone. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Bad news had a particular smell to it, like gunpowder before the spark, like blood before the wound. "Federal Marshal, coming from Fort Worth with extradition papers signed by a judge in Massachusetts." Tobias folded the telegram with hands that didn't quite steady. "Tom says the man's legitimate, not one of Whitmore's hired guns. Former Texas Ranger reputation for being fair, but unmovable on matters of law. When end of the week, maybe sooner if he pushes hard." Tobias looked at her with eyes that held too many things, regret and determination, and a kind of fierce protectiveness that made her throat tight. "This changes things, Evangeline. A federal marshal with proper papers, that's not something I can just shoot my way through." "I know. We need a lawyer, a real one from Fort Worth, someone who understands federal law and can argue this in front of a judge who won't be swayed by Whitmore's money." He moved to her, took her hands in his rough, calloused ones. "I'm going to ride to Fort Worth today. There's a man there, Josiah Crawford, who handled some legal work for me after Miriam died. He's honest, sharp, and he owes me a favor. If anyone can find a way through this, it's him." "How long will you be gone?" 2 days, maybe 3. He squeezed her hands. "Marcus will be in charge while I'm away. You stay close to the house. You don't go anywhere alone. And if Whitmore or any of his men show up before I get back, you send someone for the sheriff immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. Tobias, promise me Evangeline." She saw the fear in him, carefully masked, but there nonetheless. Fear that he'd ride away and come back to find her gone, taken, disappeared into whatever hell Whitmore had planned. It was the fear of a man who'd already lost everything once and couldn't survive losing it again. "I promise." He kissed her then, hard and desperate, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her. When he pulled back, his voice was rough. "Whatever happens, whatever that lawyer finds or doesn't find, I want you to know this wasn't just a contract for me, not anymore. Maybe it was at first, but now I know." She touched his face, felt the scrape of stubble against her palm. "I know because it's not just a contract for me either." Something that might have been hope flickered in his eyes. "When this is over, when Whitmore's dealt with and you're safe, we should talk about what this is, about what we want it to be." "Yes." The word came out like a promise, like a prayer. "When this is over." He left within the hour, riding hard for Fort Worth on his best horse, with a rifle across his saddle, and a determination that made Evangeline believe just for a moment that maybe the law could be on their side for once. Maybe justice existed somewhere outside of fairy tales and wishful thinking. She watched until he disappeared into the shimmering distance, then turned back to the house where Silas waited and tried to ignore the feeling that she'd just watched something precious right away, possibly forever. The first night without Tobias was the hardest. Evangeline had grown accustomed to his presence, the sound of his boots on the stairs at night, the way he checked the locks on every door before bed, the solid reassurance of knowing he was just down the hall if anything went wrong. His absence left the house feeling hollow, exposed like a fortress with the gates standing open. She lay awake in Miriam's bed, their bed now. She'd started thinking of it, though they still hadn't shared it, and listened to the old house settle and creak. Every sound became a threat, every shadow a potential intruder. Silas slept peacefully in the next room, exhausted from a day spent helping Billy mend fence, but Evangeline couldn't find that same oblivion. Around midnight she gave up trying. She pulled on her robe and went downstairs, thinking maybe warm milk would settle her nerves, calm. The racing thoughts that insisted Whitmore would choose tonight to attack that Marcus, and the hands wouldn't be enough, that by morning she'd be on a train back to Boston, and everything they'd built would be ashes. She found Paloma in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of something that steamed gently in the lamplight. "Can't sleep either?" the older woman asked. "Every time I close my eyes I see—" Evangeline stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You see him coming for you. You see yourself back in that place where you got no power, no say, no way out." Paloma poured a second cup from the pot on the stove, tea strong and dark. "I know that fear, girl. Different man, different circumstances, but the same fear underneath." Evangeline sat, wrapped her hands around the cup for warmth despite the lingering heat of the day. "How did you survive it when you lost your husband? By putting one foot in front of the other, by doing the next thing that needed doing, and then the next, and then the next after that, by letting myself be angry instead of just scared." Paloma's eyes were distant, seeing something years gone. "My Miguel the Rangers shot him for stealing cattle that weren't his. Except he didn't steal nothing, he was tracking strays from our own herd. But Rangers, they didn't care about the truth. They cared about having a body to show the ranchers proof they were doing their jobs. I'm sorry. Sorry don't change nothing. But what I learned, what kept me alive when I wanted to die, is that men like the ones who killed Miguel, like this Whitmore who's hunting you, they count on us being too scared to fight back. They count on us believing we got no power, no rights, no voice that matters." She leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "But you got something they don't count on." "What?" "You got Tobias Brennan. And that man, he's the kind who'd burn the world down before he'd let someone hurt what belongs to him. You think he's riding to Fort Worth just to find a lawyer?" Paloma shook her head. "That man's going to come back with a way to win, or he's going to come back ready to run with you to Mexico if that's what it takes. Either way, he ain't giving you up without a fight that'll be talked about for years. He shouldn't have to fight this hard. Shouldn't have to risk everything for a wife he didn't even want. Didn't want. Paloma's laugh was low and knowing. Girl, open your eyes. That man wanted you from the moment you walked onto this ranch. Maybe not in the way he wants you now, but he wanted the life you represented, the possibility of something besides grief and loneliness and working himself to death for nothing. And now that he's had a taste of what family feels like again, she reached across the table, gripped Evangeline's hand. Now he's going to fight like a man with everything to lose, because he is. Evangeline felt tears burn behind her eyes. I'm scared, Paloma. I'm so scared that no matter how hard we fight, Whitmore's going to win, because he always wins. Because men like him always win. Not always. Sometimes they push too hard. Sometimes they underestimate the woman they're hunting and the man standing between them and her. Sometimes God looks down and decides enough is enough. They sat together until the tea went cold, two women who'd loved and lost and learned to survive, sharing the particular communion of those who understood that sometimes courage was just fear, that said its prayers and kept moving anyway. When Evangeline finally went back to bed, she slept. Not well, but she slept. Tobias returned on the third day with a lawyer in tow and a plan that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. Josiah Crawford was nothing like Evangeline expected. She'd pictured someone older, gray-haired, and dignified in the way of men who made their living with words. Instead, Crawford was barely 30, sharp-eyed and sharp-dressed, with the kind of restless intelligence that made him seem like he was always 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. They gathered in Tobias's office. Evangeline, Tobias Crawford, and Tom Cartwright, who'd ridden out from Red River to add his perspective as both former marshal and current sheriff. Here's what we're dealing with, Crawford said, spreading papers across the desk like he was laying out cards for a high-stakes game. The extradition papers are legitimate. Massachusetts has filed criminal charges against Mrs. Brennan for fraud and conspiracy to defraud a creditor. The federal marshal has jurisdiction. If he serves those papers, she has to go back to Massachusetts to face trial. But the charges are false, Evangeline protested. I never defrauded anyone. William took out loans, William gambled, William died and left me with debts I didn't even know existed. I believe you. Unfortunately, belief isn't evidence. Crawford pulled out another document. However, I did some digging in Fort Worth, sent some telegrams to associates in Boston. Turns out, Chase Whitmore has a pattern. 7 women in the past 5 years, all widows of men who borrowed from him, all charged with fraud. When they couldn't pay, all conveniently offered the chance to work off their debts in ways that would make a decent person sick. Tom leaned forward. You're saying this is a trafficking operation disguised as debt collection. I'm saying it's starting to look that way, but proving it in court is another matter. Whitmore's careful. He uses legitimate legal channels. The women who might testify against him, most are too scared, too broken, or too dead to be useful witnesses. Dead. Evangeline's voice came out small. 2 suicides, 1 disappeared, the rest. Crawford's face was grim. The rest learned to stop fighting. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Evangeline felt Tobias's hand find hers under the table, squeeze hard enough to hurt, and she held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had started tilting. So what's the play? Tobias asked. Because I'm not letting him take her. Marshal or no marshal papers, or no papers, I'm not letting that happen. The play is we flip the script. Crawford pulled out a fresh piece of paper, started making notes. We don't just defend against the extradition, we go on offense. We file a federal complaint against Whitmore for operating a criminal enterprise across state lines. We get those other women to testify, show the pattern, prove this isn't about one debt, but about a systematic operation to exploit vulnerable women. Will they testify? Tom asked. The other women, some might. if they believe they'll be protected, if they think there's a real chance of winning. Crawford looked at Evangeline. It's risky. It means putting you in the crosshairs even more than you already are. Means potentially going to trial not as a defendant, but as a witness against Whitmore. Means making yourself the face of every woman he's destroyed. How long would that take? Tobias demanded. How long before it's resolved? Months, maybe a year. Federal cases move slow. Crawford's voice was clinical, laying out the hard truths. In the meantime, we'd need to delay the extradition. File motions challenge the validity of the charges, argue that Mrs. Brennan needs to remain in Texas to cooperate with the federal investigation. It's a delaying action, but it might work. Might. Tobias's jaw clenched. I need better than might. Better than might doesn't exist when you're fighting a man with Whitmore's resources through a legal system that's designed to protect property more than people. Crawford's eyes were sympathetic but unyielding. This is the best shot we have. Unless you're planning to kill him, which I strongly advise against for both legal and practical reasons. Tobias was quiet for a long moment, and Evangeline could see him calculating odds, weighing options, trying to find a path through impossible terrain. Finally he spoke. What do you need from us? Everything. Every piece of correspondence from Whitmore. Every record of William's debts, every threat made, every lie told. I need dates, amounts, witnesses to conversations. I need to build a timeline that shows this wasn't legitimate debt collection, but predatory targeting. Crawford looked at Evangeline. And I need you to be willing to stand up in court and tell your story, all of it, including the parts that hurt. I'll do it. The words came out stronger than she felt. If it means stopping him from hurting anyone else, I'll do it. Good. Because the federal marshal arrives tomorrow. When he does, we're going to file our motion immediately, ask for a stay of the extradition pending the federal investigation. Crawford started gathering his papers. It's going to get ugly, Mrs. Brennan. Whitmore's going to fight dirty. He's going to dig up every piece of your past, every mistake you've made, every vulnerability he can exploit. You need to be ready for that. I'm ready. But she wasn't. Not really. How could anyone be ready to have their life dissected in public, to have their worst moments held up for judgment, to stand exposed before the world and hope that truth mattered more than power after Crawford and Tom left? Evangeline stood at the window watching the sun set over the prairie, painting, everything in shades of amber and crimson. She felt Tobias come up behind her, felt his hands settle on her shoulders with a gentleness that still surprised her. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. We could run. I've got money saved. We could go to California, Mexico somewhere Whitmore can't reach. Start over with new names. And spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for him to find us, teaching Silas to be afraid. She turned in his arms, looked up at him. No, I'm done running. If there's even a chance we can stop him, expose what he is, protect those other women, I have to try. Even if it costs you everything. I don't have everything to lose anymore. I have you. I have Silas. I have this place, these people, this life we're building. Those things are worth fighting for, worth risking for. She touched his face, felt him lean into her palm. You taught me that. You taught me that standing your ground matters more than playing it safe. Something fierce and proud flickered in his pale eyes. You're braver than anyone I've ever known. I'm terrified. That's what makes it brave. He pulled her close, held her against his chest, where she could hear his heart beating steady and strong. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes after we face it together, you understand you're not alone in this. I know. And she did know. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to have a partner, someone who stood beside her instead of in front of or behind someone who trusted her strength while offering his own. They stood there as darkness fell, holding each other against tomorrow's uncertainties, and Evangeline felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but a kind of determined calm. She'd spent so long running, hiding, making herself small in hopes the monsters wouldn't notice. But monsters always noticed. The only question was whether you faced them standing or cowering. She was done cowering. The federal marshal arrived at dawn riding a bay horse and wearing a star that caught the early light like a promise or a threat, depending on which side of the law you stood. Marshal William Pike was exactly what Tom had described a former Texas Ranger gone federal, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life on the hard side of justice. He sat his horse like he'd been born to it, and when he dismounted in front of the house, his movements were careful, measured the economy of someone who'd survived by never making careless gestures. Tobias met him on the porch with Evangeline, standing slightly behind, not hiding, but letting her husband handle the initial confrontation. Marcus and 3 other hands were visible in strategic positions around the ranch, armed but not threatening, a show of strength wrapped in courtesy. Marshal Pike. Tobias didn't offer his hand. I assume you're here about my wife. That I am. Pike's voice was rough, worn smooth like river rock. I have extradition papers signed by a federal judge requesting the return of Evangeline Ashford. Excuse me, Evangeline Brennan, to Massachusetts, to face criminal charges. I'm obligated to serve these papers and escort her back east. Those charges are fraudulent. My lawyer has filed a motion to stay the extradition pending a federal investigation into the creditor's activities. Pike pulled a folded paper from his coat, read it briefly. I received notice of the motion this morning via telegraph. Judge hasn't ruled on it yet. Until he does, my orders stand. Then you'll have to wait for the ruling. Tobias's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. My wife isn't going anywhere until a judge says she has to be. Mr. Brennan, I understand your position. I do. But I have my orders. If I don't execute them, I'm in violation of federal law. I'd rather not have to arrest you for interfering with a federal officer. And I'd rather not have to explain to my lawyer why you tried to enforce an order that's been challenged in court. Tobias shifted slightly, and Evangeline knew he was calculating distances, positions, whether this could be resolved with words or if it would require the kind of violence that couldn't be taken back. Pike seemed to sense it too. He held up a hand, pacific. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. I've got a copy of the stay motion here. Judge Barrett in Fort Worth is reviewing it now. I'm willing to wait 48 hours for his ruling. That's more than fair considering. Considering what? Considering I could just take her now and let the lawyers sort it out in Massachusetts. Pike's eyes were sympathetic but firm. I'm trying to be reasonable here, Brennan. I'm trying to respect that you're a man protecting his wife. But the law is the law, and eventually it's going to have its say. Before Tobias could respond, Evangeline stepped forward. She dressed carefully this morning in her simplest dress, her hair pulled back severely, trying to look like the kind of woman who wouldn't commit fraud, who deserved the benefit of doubt. Marshal Pike, she said, keeping her voice steady, I understand you're just doing your job. I respect that. But the man who filed these charges, Chase Whitmore, he's not interested in justice. He's interested in destroying me because I escaped from a situation that would have destroyed me anyway. If you take me back to Massachusetts, I won't get a fair trial. I'll get whatever verdict Whitmore's money can buy. Pike studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. That may be true, ma'am, but I can't make judgments about the merits of the case. All I can do is enforce the law as written. Even when the law is being used as a weapon, especially then, because the alternative is every man becoming his own judge, and that's how you get blood in the streets. He looked at Tobias. 48 hours. Judge Barrett will rule by then. If he denies the stay, I'll have to take Mrs. Brennan into custody. But until then, she's free to remain here under your supervision. Fair enough. It wasn't fair. Nothing about this was fair, but it was better than the alternative, and they all knew it. Fair enough, Tobias said finally. But you should know, Marshal, if that judge rules against us if you try to take my wife, there's going to be a problem. I figured as much. Pike moved toward his horse with the same careful precision he'd shown dismounting. For what it's worth, Brennan, I read the file on Whitmore. I read what your lawyer's alleging. If even half of it's true, the man deserves worse than anything the law's likely to give him. But I can't act on allegations. I can only act on orders. He swung into the saddle, settled himself. 48 hours. I'll be at the hotel in Red River if you need to reach me. They watched him ride away, and Evangeline felt Tobias's hand find hers, gripped tight enough to bruise. 48 hours, she whispered. What if the judge rules against us? Then we run, tonight, before Pike can come back. His voice was flat, final. I meant what I said. I'm not letting him take you. Tobias, no. He turned to her, and she saw something wild in his eyes, something that had been there since the war but carefully leashed until now. I've lost everything once, Evangeline. I buried my wife and daughter, and damn near buried myself with them. I'm not doing it again. I can't. If we have to run, if we have to spend the rest of our lives hiding, that's what we'll do, but I'm not handing you over to that bastard. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that running would solve nothing, that they'd just be trading one kind of prison for another. But looking at his face, at the desperate determination there, at the love he still couldn't quite name but couldn't hide either, she understood. This wasn't about the ranch or the law or even justice anymore. This was about a man who'd learned too late that he could love again, fighting to keep the only family he had left. Okay, she said softly. If the judge rules against us, we run. Together. The next 48 hours passed like years and seconds all at once. Crawford rode back and forth between the ranch and Fort Worth 3 times, carrying additional evidence, filing supplementary motions, doing everything legally possible to sway Judge Barrett's decision. Tom Cartwright brought news from Red River. Whitmore had taken rooms at the hotel, was holding court like some kind of visiting dignitary, buying drinks for local businessmen and spreading his version of events. The poor wronged creditor just trying to collect what was legally his, being thwarted by a violent rancher and his criminal wife. Some people believed him. Others, who knew Tobias, didn't. The town was dividing itself along invisible lines, choosing sides in a conflict that would eventually demand something more than just opinions. At the ranch, life continued with surreal normality. Silas still had his lessons with Paloma, still helped Billy with the horses, still called Tobias Pa with unthinking ease. The cattle still needed tending, the fences still needed mending. The endless work of keeping a ranch alive still demanded attention, but underneath it all, everyone was waiting. Waiting for word from Fort Worth, waiting for Marshal Pike to ride back with a verdict, waiting for the hammer to fall or miracle of miracles to miss them entirely. On the second night, with hours left before the deadline, Evangeline couldn't sleep. She wandered the house like a ghost, touching things the banister Miriam's hand had worn smooth the table where 12 cowboys ate every day, the rifle above the mantel that represented everything Tobias had fought for and survived. She found him in the barn, which should have been dark, but glowed with lamplight. He was in the tack room methodically oiling saddles and bridles, doing the kind of mindless work that kept hands busy when the mind was too full to rest. "Can't sleep either?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up, and in the lamplight she could see exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "Keep thinking about what we'll need if we have to run, how much cash I can pull from the bank without raising suspicion, which horses will make the journey to Mexico, what story we tell Silas so he's not scared. Tobias, I've been making lists, routes south, people who might hide us, places we could start over." He set down the saddle he'd been working on, rubbed his face with hands that had started shaking. "And I keep thinking this is my fault. I brought you here. I made you a target by marrying you. If I'd just paid your debt and let you go, Whitmore wouldn't have any hold on you now. If you'd done that, I'd be dead or worse. Don't you understand?" She moved into the room, took the rag from his hands, made him look at her. "You saved my life. You gave Silas a home. You gave me a reason to stop running and start fighting. How is any of that your fault? Because I was selfish. I told myself I needed sons, needed heirs, needed someone to make this ranch mean something after I'm gone. But that was a lie. The truth is, I was lonely. I was so goddamn lonely I couldn't stand my own company anymore. And I used your desperation to fix it. You think I didn't use yours too? You think I was some kind of victim in this arrangement? She cupped his face in her hands, made him see her. I came here with nothing. You offered me everything. Yes, the terms were hard. Yes, I had to give up things I never thought I'd have to bargain with. But I wasn't forced. Peaceful, triumphant scene, Montana Ranch, spring day, family happiness achieved. Wide establishing shot, expanded. Copper Ridge Ranch cabin, now 4 rooms. Glass windows, proper kitchen, visible, surrounded by thriving property. New barn, fenced pastures with cattle, blooming wildflower meadow. Foreground center family group on cabin porch. Cowboy, 43, now silver-streaked beard, content smile, weathered face relaxed, clean work clothes standing with arm around woman, 29. Heterochromia eyes, one brown, one green scar on cheek. Choppy auburn silver hair, now grown to shoulders in healthy waves. Simple but clean blue dress showing 7 months pregnant belly. He holds infant son, 4 months visible, heterochromia eyes, inherited from mother in other arm. Beside them, younger woman, 18, temperance, resembles Delia, but no scar, healthy teaching slate visible, engaged to deputy, mid-ground small schoolhouse building with children visible inside Mexican settlement, Esperanza, houses in distance. Background mountains, spring green meadows, blue sky, hope, visualized. Mood justice, achieved love, triumphant family built from ashes, legacy of courage, happy ending, earned through suffering. Western epilogue, bright natural spring light, community, prosperity, 1886. Montana Territory, redemption, complete dignity, restored future, secured.